Here's the situation. The good news is that we have secured funding for Ukraine's needs, both to function as a state and also for Ukraine's military needs. 2026 and 2027, and most importantly, that it comes into effect early 2026, enabling the combination with the IMF's corresponding financial efforts. This was very important. As you know, the money is basically running out in Ukraine at the beginning of next year. That is the good news, and it is the most important, of course. The bad news is that there was not at all sufficient support to use the first Russian assets as the basis for this funding. As you know, it would require a qualified majority, including, of course, Belgium, which holds 90% of the assets. It was not anywhere near this at all. I regret that. I have had a feeling, and I have said a few times as well, that I have not mortgaged this success in any way previously, but have always suspected, really, that more countries fundamentally have the same or similar objections, as Belgium has been very clear about for some months now. So that is the bad news. In order not to jeopardize Ukraine's defensive capability from early 2026, we from the Swedish side and other countries that primarily wanted the frozen Russian assets as a resource have accepted that the EU borrows the money jointly for Ukraine. It became possible because 3 countries, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, allowed or accepted that this decision was made against their will. They therefore did not use their veto against not being responsible for any of the costs that these loans naturally entail. And a unanimous parliament has also recently supported that decision. I had the EU committee gathered at 2:30 to confirm this, because it was well known that our primary wish was to use the second option. The fourth thing I want to say is that simultaneously, we decide that the Commission will continue to explore the possibilities of using and finding consensus on the frozen Russian assets. And lastly, there is a backstop, a word in Swedish, but a paragraph at the end of our conclusions about the frozen Russian assets. They are thus retained as a guarantee for the loans that we now issue to Ukraine. That is, when Ukraine receives reparations in various ways after a peace agreement, which primarily pays off those loans, and secondly, the EU that decides how the frozen Russian assets should be used. So there is a lock that is directly connected to Ukraine. Those were the decisions we made today. As I said, I regret that we could not make the decision that Sweden, the Baltic countries, the rest of the Nordics, Germany, and Poland have been very strong supporters of. But the most important thing is, of course, that we have funding that ensures Ukraine does not face an acute crisis at the beginning of 2026. In what way did it clash with the Russian assets? What was it that prevented progress, or that made the decision to not continue those discussions? I believe there was never the consensus some might have perceived. There are, after all, several countries that have felt precisely this for a long time. And then it was described for a long time as an impossibility, because the large Euro countries opposed it. Then when Germany changed its stance, when we perceived that France also changed its stance, the Commission described as fully possible, and having more discussions about this, it suddenly became a very lively alternative. And then it was Belgium's many, and as I have always said, quite legitimate questions. What risks could it entail? So they worked on it systematically and have answers to those questions that we thought were quite satisfactory. But a large number of countries did not agree. There has been much discussion about the moral aspect of the Russian assets, that they are not doing it now. What does this mean? I say that Ukraine gets the money, but it carries a different signal value. Yes, of course, it carries a different signal value. It is clear that it would have been a country waging a war of aggression against another country. To be able to show that we support the attacked country with the attacking country's resources. Naturally, it carries an especially strong symbolism. Now, instead, the EU is borrowing money and is doing it for good reasons, as there was no other alternative. But there were strong reasons for us to be in favor of using the frozen Russian assets. Now we have talked about the importance of reaching this financing to send a political signal and indicate that the EU is a player to be reckoned with, if you put it that way. How strong is this signal when choosing this solution instead? You should take the most important thing, which is still the most important. The crucial thing is that the EU acts to make the money available so that Ukraine does not end up in an acute problem, and that the EU remains firm in its support for Ukraine should not be overlooked. That is the big issue in all of this. I mention the other since it has been the focus so much. The frozen Russian assets have also been a kind of geopolitical signal in this. Now the EU is taking great responsibility, and we support the EU in doing so. But we saw another way that could have been better. It was primarily the Nordic, the Baltic, Germany and Poland, the Netherlands, that were very strong advocates for doing this. But it would not have been enough to achieve a qualified majority. Are you disappointed? This isn't so much about my emotional life here. I think, and Sweden thinks, that the frozen Russian assets would have been a better method. Then I would have used Russia's money, not the EU's money. There was a strong signal to do that in that way too. I also think it would have shown that Europe acts more forcefully. Now, Ukraine gets roughly the same amount of money, at least the money that was meant as payments from the frozen Russian assets. So that's the most important thing, of course. But there were reasons why we thought other solutions would have been better. Does it matter for Swedish taxpayers? Yes, ultimately it should be how long these loans are used, of course. But ultimately one incurs a loan cost, and now there are clear statements that also concern the use. It should be Russian reparations and such things. But of course it makes a difference whether the EU borrows the money and takes that responsibility, or if in various ways we use the resources we have frozen because they are Russian. So it is clear that this is also why Sweden fundamentally has the principle that we do not think that this is a good idea. And also the reason why I wanted to go back to the EU committee to also have the mandate to do the only thing that was now available as an alternative if we were not to betray Ukraine. Just to clarify, the proposal to use the Russian assets that was on the table today is dead. It is not what the Commission is continuing to work with. No, that proposal is a very detailed proposal that the Commission has developed together with Belgium. One should remember, and as I understand it, Belgium was fully prepared to proceed with, if everyone else met the assurances that Belgium wanted. Then I have said many times that Belgium had a number of very legitimate objections. They did not want to bear the entire responsibility just because the money was located there. But it was clear that there was no support. So it was not Belgium primarily that stopped everything, but rather countries that did not want to provide guarantees. I am convinced, if all the other countries had responded in the way that those of us who were for using Russian assets did, then Belgium would have contributed its part. However, Belgium was very skeptical. They have been the whole time. A final question. Regarding these joint loans, have you decided to borrow 90 billion euros? That is what there is now a mandate for in the conclusion. And it is not about asking the Commission to come up with a proposal, but it is a firm decision. This is urgent because this money needs to be provided quickly. It is partly for Ukraine's own sake, but it is also connected to providing conditions for the IMF to continue. How large is the Swedish guarantee? Is it equivalent to what would have been the guarantee to Belgium? No, it doesn't work like that at all. Instead, the loans become part of the EU's total costs. So clearly, the EU will incur a loan cost for this. And it is financed in the usual way. But it will somehow be accounted for in a way that I can't technically explain. On Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. But it is guaranteed by the EU budget. By the EU budget, exactly. It is the EU budget that guarantees it. There are no individual guarantees here. How great is the pressure now to continue with the reparations loans when a solution is available? It's clear that it is much, much less. You could possibly say that now we have the money locked very tightly now, since we have also permanently frozen the funds. Previously, we had a mechanism where every 6 months you had to renew the freezing of these funds. Now they are very secure where they are, but naturally, since the funds for Ukraine's purposes are being handled in a different way, the pressure on this will be much less. But I believe the Commission will continue its work and look for possible ways. Those funds are secure, you say. How big is the risk that in a peace settlement, in an agreement that has been talked about before, the USA and Russia share those funds? There are so many unknown factors now. The good unknown factor is that it might be the case that there are talks currently happening. As I mentioned after the meeting in Berlin earlier this week, I still thought there were promising descriptions of security guarantees that we haven't heard before. As I always say, I'll believe it when I see it. To say such a thing is one thing, to actually live up to it is something else. But it was a different tone, I must say. Then no one can access the money. It's the EU that makes decisions about them. That's how it is. So the existence of the money also means that the EU naturally has an influence over potential agreements made after a war.